In the fall of 1966, I was finishing my graduate studies at Tulane University. The chairman of the history department called me into his office and said, "You will be applying for a job this winter and spring. What kind of job are you looking for?" I replied, "My dream is to teach in a small liberal arts college close to New York City or San Francisco." He waited a moment. Then he said, "We've never had anybody get a job like that. I suggest that you apply to several southern schools. You will have a much better chance of finding a job there." He was wrong. I found my dream institution. I did not come to Drew with the idea of moving on to a presumably better place. Only 4 or 5 weeks into fall semester, 1967, I called my parents on Sunday night, as I always did, and told them I was not going to return to Georgia. I said, "I will spend my whole career in New Jersey. It's the right place for me. Even today, I feel incredibly lucky for my 41 years in Drew and for being here with you today." I want us to think about the American presidency for a little while. I plan to ask myself several questions and then try to answer them. My hope is that my questions and answers will provoke you to think about questions and answers of your own. I begin with humility. Somerset Maugham, an English novelist, I expect before most of your time, an English novelist once said, "There are 3 rules for writing a great novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are." Well, the 3 rules for doing the presidency today, nobody knows what they are either. One other introductory comment, a little more personal humility. For many years, up to 2016, I was part of a group of Drew faculty members with Doug Simon, Phil Mundo, people like that. Every 4 years, we gave talks about the upcoming presidential election. We were introduced as experts. But in 2016, it became clear that my expertise is flawed and limited. I was totally convinced that Donald Trump could not win. Given his record of cheating employees and business partners, his blatant racism, his misogyny, his attacks on military heroes, I was certain that he could not win. I was forced by that election to relearn something I had been told since childhood. I now know that it's true. Anyone can be elected president of the United States. Anyone. My first question is, what is the relationship between the Constitution and the presidency? Is the Constitution still relevant today? 4 years ago, I would have answered this question relatively quickly. Today, I will spend more time on the question than on any other question I'm going to talk about today. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention invented the presidency. Members of the convention wanted an executive. That's what they called it, an executive. But their vision was unclear. They knew what they did not want, a king, but they were less certain about what they wanted. Look at the Constitution they wrote. Article 1 describes the powers of Congress with specificity in 10 sections. The language is absolutely clear. Quote, "The Congress shall have the power to levy and collect taxes, to borrow money," and so unquote, and so forth. That's clear. We know what it means. Article 2, let me emphasize for a moment the numbers. 1 was Congress, 2 was the executive. Article 2 is about the executive. It only has 4 sections, not 10. Here it is said that the president is the commander-in-chief. But what is a commander-in-chief? There is no specificity, no explaining, no filling out. Historians have concluded that what the convention wanted was a president who was strong enough to execute laws, but not as powerful as a king. From the beginning, the Constitution has been difficult to interpret. Even members of the Constitutional Convention, who later became senators or representatives, disagreed about its meanings. Even more significantly, James Madison, sometimes called the father of the Constitution, James Madison disagreed with himself. The young Madison believed that the Constitution created a strong national government, while the older Madison found support for states' rights in the document. It's not surprising that 233 years later, we find it difficult sometimes to relate to the Constitution. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, you could often predict how a president would govern by how he viewed the Constitution. James Buchanan was a Democrat who had a fairly strict view of the document and what you could do in terms of what it said. When Southern states began seceding, he said that secession was clearly unconstitutional, but he added that the Constitution did not give him the power to do anything to stop the secessions. Abraham Lincoln disagreed completely. He said that he swore an oath, quote, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, end quote. And the only way to do that was to stop states from seceding. During the war that followed, Lincoln broadened and expanded what came to be called the war powers of the presidency. Critics called him a would-be dictator for actions like the Emancipation Proclamation. Early in the 20th century, William Howard Taft was so upset by Theodore Roosevelt's presidency that he wrote a book that argued that Roosevelt's presidency was unconstitutional. Taft said that a president could only do those relatively few things that are listed in the Constitution. Roosevelt vigorously disagreed. He said that a president could do anything not specifically forbidden by the Constitution. Up to perhaps as late as the 1950s, you could tell a lot about a president by knowing how he interpreted the Constitution. Throughout the 20th century, the government grew larger and larger, and the executive branch grew larger as well. Even under presidents like Warren G. Harding, the executive branch gained more influence over the federal budget. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt decided that so much growth had occurred that he needed help. Congress investigated and concluded that the president could appoint 5 new advisors to work in the White House. There was a huge outcry and protest about this, but ultimately Roosevelt was able to increase his staff because it was clear that they had to do way more than the staff used to have to do in the past. In times closer to today, the Constitution is not often mentioned or referred to in assessing presidents in the way that we did in the 19th century. Partly this was because presidents seem largely to have adopted Theodore Roosevelt's viewpoint. 2 very recent examples. George Bush II, that's the younger Bush, was told by his advisors that he could do anything that he felt necessary to counter terrorism, including torture. As a candidate for the presidency, Barack Obama criticized Bush's claims of broad power, but he continued to use many of the same powers, even as he argued that he was more modest in his claims of power and its usage. In general, power accrued to the executive steadily during and after World War II, regardless of who was president. After undeclared wars in Korea and Vietnam, and after the Watergate scandals, Congress tried to halt the growth in the powers of the presidency. In 1973, Congress passed a War Powers Act that required the president, under certain conditions, to report to Congress, and even required Congress to vote about military actions overseas. Soon, presidents found ways to disregard or to maneuver around the law's requirements. One historian described it this way, quote, "Every president since Nixon has disregarded and in some cases flatly disobeyed the provisions of the War Powers Act." Not much power there. Would the founders have been unhappy with this? Yes. Because one of the key differences between a king and a president was that a king could declare war and a president could not. But in the 18th century, the United States was a small, isolated country with weak neighbors. By the late 20th century, the world was smaller and American interests were global. The world had changed. Other Watergate reforms were more successful than the War Powers Act. Congress created a new office of inspector generals to oversee executive branch actions in order to root out waste and fraud and the misuse of government powers. Congress also forbade impoundment, an unusual word, impoundment, to prevent the president or other members of the executive branch from substituting their preferences for how to spend money from those of Congress and what the law said. Finally, thirdly, the Justice Department in the 1970s developed rules establishing it as an independent office with independent authority to oversee the presidency. What I've said up to this point was sufficient 4 years ago. I didn't really need to add anything to it. Our recent presidents, only Jimmy Carter, after Watergate, seemed somewhat concerned about what some people called an imperial presidency. So issues involving the Constitution seemed relatively few, but the world has changed since 2016. President Trump today claims extraordinary powers. He says, quote, "When someone is president of the United States, the authority is total," end quote. He adds that Article 2 gives him, quote, "the right to do whatever I want," end quote. He also said, just to do something he likes to do particularly well, and that is to keep us off balance, he also said that, quote, "reading the Constitution is like reading a foreign language," end quote. Trump has done more than talk. He has also rejected the Watergate reforms completely. He is firing inspector generals who are doing what they're supposed to do. He impounded funds that were supposed to go to Ukraine. And he has been aided by Attorney General William Barr, who has reversed the Justice Department's independence and transformed it into an agency to serve the president. A former head of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel under Reagan and Bush 1, his name is hard to pronounce, Douglas DeMise, said recently, quote, that George III would have loved Trump and Barr. From Woodrow Wilson to Lyndon Johnson, Democrats favored a stronger national government and a more powerful presidency than Republicans did. But they also believed in a fairly strong Congress that could check and balance the presidency. Today, Barr and Trump are supporting what they're calling a unitary presidency, who cannot be checked by anyone except by impeachment or election. And it's not simply Barr and Trump. This view first emerged in the Reagan administration and has gradually attracted attention from more Republicans. It's a relatively new concern or relatively new idea gaining support. Okay, enough with that. There are no other kinds of constitutional concerns, though, that have had little to do with Trump that are also emerging today. One, the Electoral College in the Senate. Both products of compromise at the Constitutional Convention are blatantly undemocratic. Today's senators representing only 30% of the public have more than 50% of the votes in the Senate. And the Electoral College ensures that there will be a similar lack of balance soon in presidential elections. For more than 200 years, only twice did an elected president fail to win at least a plurality of votes. But it has already happened twice more since 2000, and demographic projections to predict more such votes. Quickly, a handful of others about the Constitution. One is the recognition today that the Constitution, coupled with the 3/5 compromise, intensified the impact of slavery on the United States by giving pro-slavery states more voting power. All presidents from Washington to Buchanan, except for the two Adamses, were either slave owners or strong supporters of slavery. Another concern is the absence of a right to vote. Still another is the Supreme Court's curious conclusion that corporations are people and that money is speech. So what was once regarded as bribery is now free speech. Enough about the Constitution. Question 2. Historians are always asked, why are there no George Washingtons or Thomas Jeffersons running for office today? I had a doctor who used to ask me this question every year when I arrived in his office for my annual physical. Actually, this one is easy. The first 6 presidents were aristocrats, or, in the case of the two Adamses, members of the New England gentry. They were born and raised to leadership. and they were much better educated than the general public. They learned early as they moved up the political ladder. They acquired useful experience. They did not ask voters to vote for them, though James Madison discovered that if he did not provide beer for his supporters, he did not win elections. They assumed that voters would recognize their positions in society and vote for them. Even the language was different. They did not run for office. They stood for office. Remember, though, that not all six were great leaders. James Monroe was no George Washington, and John Quincy Adams seems a little strange with his habit of swimming nude in the Potomac River, even in the winter. By the late 1820s, when the American political world became more democratic and political parties became more important, voters wanted people who were more like them, more democratic and even populist candidates. Andrew Jackson fit the bill. He was rich, but he was a self-made man who'd made his own success. A campaign slogan described the election in 1828 between John Quincy Adams, quote, "who can write," versus Andrew Jackson's, quote, "who can fight." Americans voted for Jackson and thereafter wanted similar candidates. In 1840, often said to be the first modern-style presidential election, William Henry Harrison, who was born in a house with 40 rooms, claimed to be born in a log cabin. Recently, Mitt Romney and both Bushes found ways to show that, and Kennedy before them, found ways to show that despite their wealth, they're simply ordinary people like you and me. Today, though, Donald Trump has challenged this tradition. In 2016, Americans elected a rich candidate who bragged openly of his wealth and the privileges that come with it, and still was elected. Earlier, this was unthinkable, and especially unthinkable for a Republican. 3. Could any of the top 3 American presidents be elected today? The public and historians agree that the top 3 are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Could they be elected today? Washington, I think, was too aristocratic, too obviously superior to all of us. When you met him, you didn't shake hands, you bowed. And it's difficult to imagine him kissing babies or drinking beer with journalists. Why would he put up with the sweat and tears of a 2-year campaign? Lincoln suffered from what was called at the time melancholy. Today we might call it depression. It's likely that he would have spent some time in a psychiatrist's office. That reminds us of Tom Eagleton, who had to resign as George McGovern's vice presidential candidate because voters worried about him being so close to nuclear weapons. And Franklin Roosevelt could not have survived pictures on television of his weak legs, or even more troublesome, a picture of his chauffeur holding him like a baby in his arms. It's very unlikely that we would consider any of the 3 as serious candidates for the presidency today. John Adams warned Americans John Adams warned Americans that all prior republics had failed. Why has the American public endured? Athens, Rome, France, and so forth usually succumb to a pattern of events. An economic, military, or other crisis would occur. And a strong man on his horse, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, seized power and buried the republic. Why did this not happen here? Virtue? Could Americans be more virtuous than other people? Unfortunately, it's unlikely. There's no evidence that Americans are more virtuous than others. James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, we would not need government." Every indication is that we need government and we are not angels. What about luck? In the early days, at least, could we have simply been lucky? George Washington could have been that strong man who seized power, but he walked away. Why? Would the father of his country have acted differently if he had children? More specifically, if he had a tall, smart, ambitious son. When the Revolutionary War ended, or when his second term as president ended, He was perfectly positioned both times to become a king, but he had no biological children, and his stepson was a disappointment. Both times he left government and returned to Mount Vernon. In the first 48 years of the American Republic, presidents serving for 40 of those years, 40 out of 48, either had no children or had only daughters. 3 presidents, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and William Harrison, serving for 8 years, had sons. In all 3 cases of a president with sons. A descendant later ran for president, with 2 succeeding in becoming president. The son of John Adams and a grandson of William Harrison. So Americans, like other people, have dynastic tendencies and had them from the beginning. And they continue today with Bushes, Kennedys, and Romneys. But the Republic was given a good start. Will it continue? Benjamin Franklin once said, "It's a republic as long as we can keep it." 5. Why does the United States ask the president to perform functions that often in other countries are performed by 2 people? Head of state, head of government, 2 different jobs. Britain has a queen as head of state and a prime minister as head of government. Just one other example, Ireland has a president as head of state and a prime minister as head of government. 2 different jobs, 2 different people holding them. The head of state speaks for the whole population of the nation, for everyone, expressing the unity of the people. That's the role of the Queen or Irish president. The head of government, the prime minister, speaks to the whole population, but in the name of the majority party and its members, speaks to the whole population in divisive terms, if you will. To achieve his or her objectives, the prime minister recognizes the divisions of the nation and criticizes the opposition party. The head of state would never criticize one or another party. American presidents have both jobs. Pursue unity on Monday like a queen and pursue division on Tuesday like a prime minister. Presidents, especially presidents in recent times, are criticized for being divisive and not promoting unity. But we required them to be both. Let's be honest. This is a difficult set of tasks, almost impossible to balance. The founders saw the president as something of a, quote, Republican king, end quote. More head of state than of government. George Washington performed this function perfectly, creating a British-style cabinet with Hamilton serving as party leader and prime minister. Washington was above it all, listening to Hamilton and Jefferson, then deciding, usually, always in favor of Hamilton. But this model was not been available for others, and it was often criticized at the time. Complicating this problem of the head of state, over the last 5 or 6 years, we have demanded more and more tasks for the head of state side of the presidency. If a hurricane occurred in Dwight Eisenhower's day, he stayed away from it because he felt that his presence would draw attention away from the work that was needed. Today, the president visits and shows interest when natural disasters strike. Presidents visit wounded soldiers, control family members of people killed in war or in disasters, celebrate with athletic teams who win a World Series or a Super Bowl. The task is much larger and requires much more emotional empathy than before. On television, you can have a sense of how much emotional empathy is there or not there. Some presidents are better than others as heads of state. Age helps, being older. So does military experience. Add some weight. Dwight Eisenhower was the best head of state in my lifetime, I think. Ronald Reagan may have been second best, with Bush 1 close. Do you remember Ronald Reagan's speech when the Challenger broke apart, killing 7 crew members? Clinton and Bush 2 were too young and callow, though Bush was effective right after 9/11. Both were more prime minister than king or queen. It took Clinton 2 years to learn how to salute properly. Bush never learned when to salute and when not to salute. You salute the uniform, not the person. Obama, despite his youth, was surprisingly effective. His race added an element of gravitas. But a segment of the population, because of his race, simply refused to accept him as an American and rejected him as head of state. Trump rejects the very idea of the role of a head of state. It's not clear that he understands that he's supposed to be a head of state. He only occasionally, usually when his wife is present, makes feeble efforts to promote unity. He is the president of his base supporters. In his view, Democrats are scum, military heroes are not really heroic, a journalist who criticizes him is a murderer. He's quite expert at dividing Americans with his tweets and public gatherings, while ignoring any responsibility for the consequences. In the future, when we elect a woman president, I wonder how she will perform these dual roles. Women have been particularly effective in Britain and Ireland and elsewhere in the role of head of state. As usual, women in the presidency, like women in other tasks, will be judged differently. 6. What patterns do we see in the history of the presidency? 1. I'm just going to go through now, go back to 1, start all over again. Now, they were talking about patterns in American history. 1, greatness is tied to crisis. In general, you don't want to live at a time when the nation has a great president. Washington was at the beginning, when everything had to be created. That wasn't too bad. Lincoln served in the Civil War. That was awful. Roosevelt faced 2 crises, the Great Depression and World War II. That was also awful. Americans have, with good reason, considered ourselves lucky for the quality of presidents in times of crisis, though many of us are not feeling so lucky today. 2, war is important. Historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote, quote, "War is the health of the presidency," end quote. George Washington was the first of several generals who became president. During wars, presidents have more freedom of action because American interests are threatened. A commander-in-chief is more powerful than a president. The names tell the story. One commands, the other presides. In every war, presidents have asserted new powers. Theodore Roosevelt felt the unfairness of it all. He realized that no matter how effective he was as president, he would never be the equal of Abraham Lincoln. It would not happen. 3, greatness is also connected to political parties. All 3 great presidents worked with a Congress controlled by his party. The same was true for Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. For Washington, it was the Federalist Party. For Lincoln, a brand new Republican Party. For Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic Party. If Roosevelt wanted to pass a Social Security Act, all he needed to do was convince Democrats. He did not need Republican votes. President Obama was able to pass the Affordable Care Act because he had 60 Democratic senators during his first 2 years in office. After that, for the next 6 years, he had to deal with Republicans and was unable to achieve major legislation. We're going to talk more about parties later. Some changes have made the job of president more difficult. When Woodrow Wilson wanted to pass the Federal Reserve Act, he had large Democratic majorities, but some Democrats were actually not supportive. What he did was let a recalcitrant senator know that if he voted for the bill, he would be able to appoint new postmasters in several towns in his state. The senator needed jobs to hand out to his supporters if he wanted to be reelected. Wilson had approximately 66,000 jobs to distribute. Today, because of the Civil Service Act and other changes, presidents have far fewer jobs to distribute. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, political parties were basically patronage parties, held together by the jobs they controlled when they won elections. Another change also affected a president's influence more recently. In John Kennedy's day, if he wanted to make a speech, all 3 television stations broadcast the speech, allowing him to reach out to the entire nation. You couldn't actually watch anything else on television at that time other than the speech. Cable television killed this centralized television world. And today's Facebook and other media have created a wild west of communication. There are no rules. There are no gatekeepers. There are fact checkers, but by the time they can respond to a speech or Twitter message, it's too late. There's no Walter Cronkite with the authority to stop rumors or lies. So today, norms of decent behavior or polite conversations or of evidence-based truth-telling are all endangered. The political system works best when the same party controls the executive and legislative branches. But party does not guarantee success or much less greatness. Buchanan had a Democratic majority supporting him. Richard Nixon was an example of what can happen if a president has no aid from his party. When he was first elected, he was alone. For the first time in over 100 years, his party, the Republicans, did not have majorities in either the Senate or the House of Representatives. Unsurprisingly, he had a disastrous relationship with Congress. A third kind of pattern. Presidents operate in two different spheres, domestic and foreign. The Supreme Court and experience declare that any president has much more power and authority in foreign affairs. Most significant domestic actions require the approval of Congress. The power to legislate is a shared power. Congress has meddled in foreign policy occasionally. See in Ireland in the 19th and early 20th centuries, or Israel today. But the norm is that, and has been for Congress, that Congress mostly leaves foreign policy to the president. Some political scientists have said that the differences are so great that they are like two different presidencies. Even time is affected. Presidents have their best chance of making a significant impact on domestic events in years 1, 3, and 5. During years 2, 4, 6, and 8, those are election years. Representatives and senators are more focused on their own re-elections than on legislation. But in foreign relations, the president can be active in all 8 years. Ronald Reagan had an active first 6 years. Then he faced years 7 and 8 with relatively little opportunity to achieve anything domestically. Then Mikhail Gorbachev appeared looking for an agreement to end the Cold War. That would be every president's dream ending. 4, types of people. What types of people become president? In the beginning, as we've noted, the presidency belonged to planters and Adamses, aristocrats. Starting with Andrew Jackson, presidents were party politicians, military generals, and occasional outsiders like Grover Cleveland or Woodrow Wilson. Americans admired self-made men who were born into poor or average families and became successful. Harry Truman was the last of the full-time politicians, and Dwight Eisenhower was the last general. Starting with John Kennedy, actually with regard to Truman, actually I said the last, one of the last, let's say, but the last of that group where they came from, where everybody came from as president. I guess Joe Biden might be considered now also one whose career had been primarily that of a full-time politician. Starting with John Kennedy. Oh, I meant to mention that Eisenhower was the last general. Starting with John Kennedy, candidates for president have been mostly celebrities and members of prominent families. Kennedys, Bushes, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, with the occasional outsider like Clinton or Obama. In this category, Trump was a distant outsider in politics, but he was a celebrity. Millions of Americans have watched him on his television show and on the appearances he made on popular shows like Friends. Because I don't watch much television and I don't read the tabloids, I miss this side of the future president completely. Successful presidential candidates need to know how to exploit television and means of communication. By 2016, they also needed to know how to exploit social media. Trump fit neatly with these skills. Today, a major problem with politics is the weakness of political parties. The members of the Constitutional Convention did not imagine the emergence of political parties. No one wanted them. George Washington's farewell address warned the public about the disastrous effects of factions. Thomas Jefferson said that if he could only go to heaven by going with a political party, he would prefer not to go. But parties were necessary when Americans turned toward democracy in the 1820s and 30s. They mobilized voters, created an organized mirror government ready to take office, and found people to serve in government from Maine to Florida and New York to San Francisco. They offered an alternative vision to what existed at a given moment. Martin Van Buren helped create a political party in New York, then played a key role in creating the National Democratic Party. As a president, though, he suffered from comparisons with Andrew Jackson, and he had no answers to this destructive recession of 1837. Today, the weaknesses of parties are best shown in the 2016 presidential election. In the Democratic Party, the second most popular candidate for president was not a Democrat. In the Republican Party, the winning candidate and future president had changed parties at least 5 times in the past and become a Republican only a short while before he ran for president. Weak parties are not effective. Weak parties are not good for democracy. 5. How have presidents been elected in the past? The first 6 presidents were basically elected by Congress. The elite elected the elite. In the 1830s, the political parties created party conventions to choose party candidates. Voters could vote for state conventions that would then elect people to attend the national conventions that then would choose candidates. In the early 20th century, primaries emerged as a way to involve the public in choosing candidates. But primaries did not decide who the candidate was. Woodrow Wilson lost almost all of the primaries he ran in, but still managed to win in the party's convention. In 1924, there was a particularly dramatic Democratic Party convention that ran for over 2 weeks, held 103 ballots, only to elect a candidate who was totally defeated. After a disastrous 1968 convention, Democrats created a new system dominated by primaries and caucuses, and Republicans soon followed. The convention was simply a showcase to celebrate the winner. From the beginning, there were flaws. Primaries never attracted many voters, and the caucus system was even worse. Soon a, quote, invisible primary, end quote, system arose. Party leaders combined with party donors to sponsor candidates and signal that they were their desired candidates, like Mondale, Bush 1, Dukakis, Clinton, Dole, Bush 2, Gore, Kerry. Obama broke this pattern and defeated Hillary Clinton, who was the candidate that year of the invisible primary in the Democratic Party. Basically, Obama decided that he would run and build his own campaign. He was the first truly self-chosen candidate. By 2016, all of the candidates in both parties were basically self-chosen. That's why there were so many. The result is a system that is pure chaos. Primaries and caucuses cannot winnow down large numbers of candidates with any efficiency. The nominating process is clearly broken in both parties. 6. There are patterns related to political cycles. All presidential candidates promise to be transformative, but there are few that transform. Mario Cuomo said that politicians campaign with poetry but govern with prose. Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan all have legitimate claims as transformative presidents. Usually the transformative presidents follow unsuccessful presidencies. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, James Buchanan, William Taft, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter. Imagine trying to be John Adams and following George Washington. Or for that matter, the first Bush trying to follow Ronald Reagan. Transformative presidents usually are accompanied by new policy commitments and new issues that are supported by their party. Franklin Roosevelt initiated a New Deal, Democratic policies and ideas largely dominated politics all the way from 1932 to 1980. In that period, Dwight Eisenhower was unusual. He was elected because he was a war hero, but he was in a difficult situation, a Republican in a Democratic era. The same thing would happen later with Clinton, who was a Democrat in a Republican cycle. We know that Carter was the last of the New Deal Democrats. We don't know if Trump is the last of the Reagan conservative Republicans. Or maybe George Bush too was. Do you see the pattern I'm suggesting? Think of George Bush 1 following Reagan, as I said before. He was like John Adams, or Andrew Johnson following Lincoln, or Truman following Roosevelt. That is one of the most difficult positions of all, trying to follow a transformative president. Under any circumstances, is not likely to be good. The most successful of those was probably Harry Truman. What is the point of all of this? The point is that it matters where you are on the political cycle. It matters when you're elected. Franklin Roosevelt would not have been Franklin Roosevelt if he'd been elected in 1924. Ronald Reagan would not have been electable in 1948. Consider Obama. He's too recent for us to know his position. But if he was the first liberal of what will become a liberal age, he wasn't very successful. Usually the first is a really transformative, first turn is a really transformative presidency. On the other hand, if he was the last liberal of a conservative age, he was remarkably successful. We simply don't know where we are now in this cycle. Wow. Let's think that today we expect too much of politics. We think that presidents have much more power than they do in reality. Does a president have much influence over the economy? Not as much as the chair of the Federal Reserve. By the way, my impression is that Donald Trump's best appointment is the chair of the Federal Reserve. He is much more active than you would expect a Republican chair to be. A president has little effect on the number and quality of jobs, and whatever effect he has must be shared with Congress. Obama came to office with a big agenda, tackling health care and the economic crisis. He was able to do much in his first 2 years, as we said before, but after that he could do little because the Republican Congress would not join him. So he followed the example. This is what you do if you're a president in the modern age, contemporary age. You follow the example, actually, of Richard Nixon, who created what some political scientists have called, quote, the administrative presidency. He used executive orders and focused on environmental regulations and tried to shape public opinion. He had to do something. The public believes that presidents can do anything. And here he was with little to offer. The problem is that the next president can easily unravel executive orders or changes in regulations. That's what Trump has done. And the pattern can continue if a Democrat follows Trump. That's the worst sort of government. One that swings right one moment, then left another. What we need is not either a large or small government. What we need is a smart government. For that, we need Congress to play a stronger role. We can't go back to the founders. Congress won't be number one, but it needs to be a better number two in our system. What about voters? I haven't mentioned us. I won't talk about voters. I want to talk about us. First, though, I want to point to a curiosity. This has to do with voting, but it's a special way before I'm going to go ahead then and talk about voters. My curiosity. In 2016, if you compare 2016 to 1896 in American elections, they're almost exactly identical. In 2016, 22 of the 23 states that voted Democratic in 1896 voted Republican, but they voted together. They didn't vote Democratic, but they voted Republican. Meanwhile, 17 of 22 states that the 1896 voted Republican would in 2016 vote Democratic. You can catch some of what I'm talking about here in this mirror image when you note that the South was, of course, Democratic in 1896, but Republican in 2016. Similarly, in other regions and other areas. Part of what's involved here is an urban versus rural pattern that has existed in much of American history. But 1896 and 2016 are very close together, each other. One feature, one reason why I called it a curiosity, the South, the Democrats, they were the more conservative party in a sense going into at least 1896, but they had a candidate who wasn't conservative at all, William Jennings Bryan, who would run 3 times for the presidency, nominated by the Democrats, defeated all 3 times. Yet he did something else that was perhaps harder than being a president. He was the key figure in 3 different constitutional amendments. Getting a constitutional amendment passed is probably harder than being elected president. But he managed to get the one that made the income tax legal, made the direct election of senators rather than the legislatures electing. And he was very crucial to the Prohibition Amendment. He also played a role, but maybe not quite at the same level in terms of women's suffrage. I say this as a curiosity. I don't have anything great to say about it. I do want to say something about voters, about you and me. I haven't said anything much about them up to this point, and I'm going to conclude really with talking about us. Obama and Trump both had a similar experience. Obama was elected with a Democratic Congress. Trump was elected with a Republican Congress. Then 2 years later, voters elected the opposite. They voted a Republican Congress, killing off Obama's opportunities, and with a Democratic Congress, narrowing down Trump's possibilities. Voters voted that way and then complained that Obama was not able to do anything big and important. But the reason was because of the voters. As voters, we citizens are not always helpful. Occasionally, indeed, we're downright strange. In 1916, President Wilson was up for re-election. He narrowly won, but there was a strange pattern of votes in New Jersey over near the ocean in the shore counties. Wilson got fewer votes than anticipated. Two political scientists have studied this and concluded that voters voted against Wilson in 1916 because of a series of attacks on swimmers by sharks in the ocean. Clearly, this would be irrational, but we humans are often irrational. 2 years later, by the way, America was hit by a horrible flu epidemic. Americans and indeed people across the world died in huge numbers. The Wilson administration did almost nothing to protect citizens, but there's no evidence that the flu affected those elections. My recommendation to you, and it applies to me as well, go vote this fall for the candidate you conclude is best, and vote for the senators and representatives in that party. Then 2 years later, unless he or she, I'll leave that option open, then unless he or she has been a total disaster, go and vote for that party again. Don't be influenced by sharks, but do pay some attention to the coronavirus. In 2024, start the same process all over again. My hope is that we do get a transformative president, but not a great one. I don't want the crisis that goes along with the great one. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Perry. I welcome everyone to unmute themselves and ask Perry whatever questions you might have for him.
Perry, Arnold Goldstein, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I remember as a young man, the nominating process for presidential candidates was done in smoke-filled rooms by Mayor Daley and Carmine DeSapio of New York and folks like that, who I suspected were basically interested in an electable candidate because an electable candidate brought with them jobs. Then sometime in the 70s, I think, democracy came in to the, and I put democracy in quotes, democracy came into the electoral process, and now relatively, in my view, unimportant states like Iowa and New Hampshire became all important in the exposure. Could you comment on the role of the party bosses like DeSapio and Daley in the nominating process, and are things better now or worse than they were back then? Thank you.
Good question. Good question. I think actually that things are worse now, in all honesty. Basically, what you want in terms of a nomination, you do want input from the public. And you do want to know what the public thinks, because you're right, you want an electable president. I think in terms of and wanting an electable president, you need the expertise of those party professionals you're talking about to assess that to some degree. And also they can know things. There was an election not that long ago when one person was being debated in terms of the public with a lot of publicity, but the party leaders all knew that he was an alcoholic. The public didn't know that. Now, as it happened, I don't know how that worked. I think it was via the invisible primary I was talking about. In the old days, the boss would just not have been sure that that person did not get anywhere. Sometimes there are things that you need insiders, and only insiders. They're the only ones who can know. On the other hand, it doesn't hurt to get some idea of what's going on in the public. Sometimes the party bosses can get too regimented, if you will. But if I had to pick between our primaries and our caucuses for picking a good president, between our primaries and the conventions, I actually would pick for the conventions. Those are my choices. James Madison very much wanted to balance democracy. You wanted democracy. You wanted more democracy than there was before. Democracy was a good thing, but you didn't want direct democracy. The public should pick the people who then picked, made the choices, made the decisions, like we pick Congress, right? That's the way we do it. And then you've got a chance to have a public influence, but you've also got a chance to bring in some expertise and some knowledge, some background, and that's what insiders know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Terry, it's Joanne. Hi, it's good to see you.
Hi, Joanne.
Hi. I'm thinking about as a real practical matter with our election coming up in, a few months away, and, with coronavirus, et cetera. So how can we do something about having, what do you call it? Remote ballots, however you say that. And what can really be done about voter suppression, which, really could tip the scales? I mean, in other words, what can we do practically to make our votes count? And short of doing away with the post office, so we can't have vote ballots, which is in the works and being tried.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about the president. Just for a moment, let me remind you, you're right, that we don't have a right to vote. That's a real weakness, but that's not a practical thing to try to deal with in 3 months. That's a constitutional amendment, no, that's not either. I'm sorry, that's a state thing, at least now. But to declare a right to vote, it probably would be a constitutional amendment. That's what's really missing, but there's no way to make that practical in any short term. That may not even be able to do it practical anyway. Short term, I think all you can do is be ready to go yourself. Sign up if your state allows it for mail ballots. But it may come down to people doing what we just saw in the last elections, where people stood out in lines, right, in Wisconsin, and stood out and made sure that they could go to vote anyway, in order to avoid especially the suppression of votes kind of thing. There are groups now that are watchdogs that are really acting. There are groups with in which lawyers, et cetera, are going to be available in ways that they were not in the past. So they're different. There are people out there trying to answer this question, and they're organizing all kinds of opportunities. Stacey Adams down in Georgia has been in the forefront of this. One could support us, say, Stacey Adams, I suppose, because she's really pushed the let's get all voters out in a very practical, pragmatic way. Other than that, I don't have any answers. Be ready to have to do whatever you have to do. Support whoever is working on this, trying it in your neighborhood, in your vote, in your state.
Professor Leavell, Eugene Lisansky here from St. Petersburg, Florida. In 2 or possibly 3 of the last few presidential elections, the candidate receiving the most popular votes lost the election. Could you talk a little bit about the Electoral College and whether or not that needs to be either eliminated or reformed in some way that will be fair?
I used to say it was going for the Electoral College to try to eliminate it, which again, you're talking about a constitutional amendment. That the effort was so big and the rewards would be relatively small, but that's changed. That's no longer true. The rewards are getting, the rewards of that change would be absolutely large because the way we're living, where liberals are living in given areas, Republicans, conservatives are living in other areas, and the Electoral College rewards geography rather than people. And the states that with smaller and smaller elections. The example I like to give is California and Wyoming. Every year in California, Wyoming is born. There's many babies born every year in California as there are people in Wyoming. And yet, though, California, they have the same number of senators. And the Wyoming voters in presidential elections, their votes count way more than those in California. So the problem is real, and it's getting worse because Democrats are going to cities in bigger and bigger numbers. Now, one thing I think of as I say this, will the virus change this? Will people stop moving to cities the way we were? That is, based on what's happened in the last 15 years, the next 15 years from now, maybe 30% of the population will elect the President of the United States. So we really need to watch. The Electoral College has indeed, I think, become a problem. And it's such a big problem that it's worth an effort to try that most difficult of all things, a constitutional amendment. There is one other thing, but it hasn't been approved yet by court, and that is a number of states have voted that their Electoral College votes will go to whichever person got the largest vote in the country at large. That would be a way to do it without having to get a constitutional amendment if enough states said that, to do that, so that would decide things. But I don't know what the Supreme Court might say of that either.
Yes.
Yes.
Bourne and Marla Bourne.
Yes.
Let me ask you to elaborate a little bit more on constitutional amendments. There was a time when they were fairly common, for lack of better words, and they kind of go in cycles between governmental improvements to social causes, for lack of better words, prohibition and that sort of stuff, to issues like poll tax, to issues like presidential succession and presidential capacitation. But we haven't had one in 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And I don't even know of one that's active at the moment.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. Why? What's happened to the initiatives on constitutional amendments, in your personal opinion?
Well, I think it has to do probably with what's happened to the political parties, Paul. As our parties have gotten since the 1960s, right? If you go back to you go back to 1896, and there are Southerners voting, right, for the most liberal candidate of all things. If you go back to the 19 teens, you have Alabama as the first state that actually voted for the direct income tax that to make that constitutional. Now, I should say this about Alabama: there probably was nobody who made enough money who had to pay it in Alabama. But there were patterns like that, if you will. They were in the parties were not just liberals in one party and conservatives in another party, and that meant that you had more variety across the ages, and it meant that you were less tribal than we are in terms of the nature of our parties. Today, whenever a presidential candidate appears, right off, you've got 48% appointing for and 48% against, and there are only this handful of people then that are not on one side or another. That can then move up and down, but that's where you start from. Well, that leaves you a long ways away from the vote you got to have in order to get a constitutional convention. Excuse me, a constitutional amendment. So you can get things through, say, Congress by relatively narrow votes. You can get polls that will give you one side or another having more, but they're nowhere near the kind of numbers you got to have, right? That's a big number out there. So I think that, and the other thing I should say is that as far as studies tend to show, basically, it's not always the public leading the party, it's the party leading the public. That is, we're now attached to a party, and we want our party to win. And even if we don't totally agree with a given issue, we will support it so that that party will be stronger and have more power to do the things we really want, etc. The nature of our political parties dramatically changed in the 1960s and 70s as Democrats in the South moved over and became Republicans. And that then pushed moderate Republicans over to the Democrats. And we got liberals in one party and conservatives in another. That's the best I can answer. It's become a monumental task even to contemplate.
Perry, for everyone, I know it's hard, it's difficult with a large group to sometimes get your questions in. So please feel free to send them to me in chat. But we do have one in chat already. Perry, could you comment on the historical power of current Black Lives Matter protests?
Oh, the current power. Well, let me start. I always like to start when I'm dealing with a current question and say, I'm a historian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not even a political journalist. I do try to pay attention, but I don't claim much expertise with this. I guess what strikes me, one, is watching the marchers. There are a lot of white people marching in those marches for Black Power, Black Lives Matter. I think that's a good sign because whites are more numerous. They're just more of us, if you will. And in order to get something done, whites need to be part of it. African Americans can't do it all on their own, and other people, even with other peoples of color, as numerous as they are. So I think that's part, at least, that gives me some optimism. Beyond that, I guess what I would say is I'm also struck by the degree to which in the world at large people are responding. It's a reminder that while we've had a lot of talk about the problems of being a global nation and people talking about the revival of nationalism, but something that's very much an American issue has even gone global. That I don't remember that happening earlier to the same kind of degree and so forth. So all of that gives me some optimism, even though, of course, I thought after Sandy Hook something might happen. There have been other incidents in the past when it simply did not happen what I thought might happen. Yes.
Any other questions?
I have one. This is Chuck Putney. And I wonder about, we didn't talk about the third branch, the Supreme Court. And I know that wasn't the topic, but, I think about the, for instance, the Congress refused to even consider Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court. And I've thought about some of President Trump's decisions to ignore what Congress wants done. For instance, the sequestering of funds for Ukraine, even if that was not permanent. And I wonder, about the language, if the executive and the Congress really get tied up in a controversy, how the Supreme Court fits into this.
Well, I should tell you at the beginning that my general impression of my own knowledge sphere, I think I'm probably weakest on the history of the Supreme Court, in all honesty. I will say this. I am impressed to some degree with David Roberts, who clearly is a conservative, but who also clearly wants the Supreme Court to be as nonpartisan as possible within that structure. The person who's head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, has influence, makes a difference, can have influence on others, etc. So again, I can express some mild optimism. The Supreme Court has, throughout most of its history, been more conservative than the Congress has been. The exception was in the 1960s and into the 70s. But I grew up in that era, and that's somewhat a misleading era. Traditionally, historically, the Supreme Court has been fairly conservative. Sometimes that works out reasonably well, and sometimes that doesn't work out so well. But it seems to be a reality for the most part.
We have another question here. Historically, has there been a time when fear of immigrants and fear of becoming a non-white majority nation was as strong as it is today among Republicans?
No, I don't think that has been as strong before. On the other hand, we've had that particular problem. For the most part, in American history, up to say the 1920s or 30s or so forth, white people were dominant and grew rapidly in size, etc. Even as other groups came in. So in particular, I guess I would just say it that way. But it's also worth noting that from the very beginning, but especially as time went on, that there was resistance to people who were not white. The people who were not white, mostly who came to America in the very early stages, were slaves, pure and simple, and no others came. It wasn't really a challenge for a while, but by 1880, we've outlawed Asians, basically. By the time we get Asians, and by the time we get to 1921, we've outlawed Africans as well as Asians, for the most part. And that basically continues until 1964. So I don't think that what motivated things then were exactly in the same, that's kind of demographic kind of thing, like we have it today, where we've got between Latinos and African Americans, we're up to maybe 40% of the American population today. And of course, that percentage is growing. We've never had anything like that before, nothing comparable to that before. So that demographic pressure is there, but we've never been friendly to people of color coming to America. And at first we didn't have to make it law, et cetera, but the United States began making it law later. By 1921, we were excluding practically everybody. Yeah.
Richard Rice says, thank you for continuing the Alumni College. It is a pleasure to join you today. So for those of you who don't know, Richard Rice is, oh gosh, I might get his year wrong, class of 54, and Theo, class of 57, I believe, or 58. and a 3-time Drew University parent who just received the service award today.
Congratulations.
But he is, he said, you just addressed the protests. Have any presidents handled protests differently in our past in a way that made significant changes or improvements?
Yes, protests. I think that Donald Trump is in a category unto himself. In all honesty, I don't remember ever any president speaking groups of people who show up at meetings with guns, and he talks about what nice people they are, etc. And he himself directly, it's not a smart political move, directly threatens, encourages police and others to use what you can only call violence. That was one thing, in a sense, in his political campaigns when he had these gatherings of his supporters, perhaps. Though even there, I can't think of anybody, any presidential candidate, who would have encouraged the police to beat up somebody that was saying something he didn't like. I think Donald Trump is totally on his own in this. I don't think anybody else fits it.
Hi, Dr. Leavell. This is Pete Carness, class 2003. How are you?
Wow. Hello, Pete.
Hi, it's great to see you. Can you talk a little bit to how the historical aspect of how parties handle their own president? It seems to me that we're in a bit of an unusual place where the Republicans are sort of falling completely in lockstep with a leader who they're obviously completely almost antithetical to what they previously expressed their positions to be. But is this a historical anomaly, or is this something that is pretty common in terms of the intra-party checks and balances and how they hold their leaders accountable?
Yeah. Well, parties have changed, views about issues over time, etc. That kind of things happened with parties and gone that way. I can't think of any example where a candidate, I'll say it sort of what I said in my talk, that is Donald Trump really a Republican even? It seems to me as a legitimate question. It's certainly something that you can say is not absolutely clear. Basically, it's like he made a deal with the Republicans that he would support Republicans in Congress, that he would support Republicans in Congress with the issues they wanted to pass, that they weren't necessarily his. In fact, he basically didn't have an agenda, which is hard to find a president with no agenda. Presumably, he wanted a health system that was better, right, than Obamacare. But he never did anything to try to create such a system. And he was surprised when it turned out that the party hadn't done that either, etc. But he would kind of supported whatever they supported, whatever they proposed, he probably would have supported because the other really didn't exactly matter. So it's I think, as with so many other things with Donald Trump, he does not fit with the past well, and it just doesn't work well. Yeah, I hope that's somewhere close to my question. Nice to see you again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You too.
Just some observations, right? Weakness of the parties, the media controls it. By the way, even now, much more in the UK. I once met Tip O'Neill buying his book, Joe, the Kennedys are a party within a party. Nominating process today, many qualified, some types won't run because of media and lack of any privacy. The South, didn't LBJ say after signing civil rights, I just lost the South for the Democrats?
All right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of
observation.
loaded. Yeah, and I had something else in there. Wasn't Washington asked to be the president? Like, he really didn't want to do it, or it's just something I thought I read one time. And Jefferson used to hold whiskey parties because they want to get people away from rum, which was British from the West Indies, and
I've never heard of that. Didn't
that
know
was
that.
in I think it's by a book written by Rorabo called The Alcoholic Republic.
Oh, I know Matt Roberbaum. I know him
It's
well.
it's when Kentucky was being around the time after Louisiana Purchase and that time. So it's just some things that came to mind. But I remember Tip O'Neill saying, yeah, the Kennedys, they're a party within a party, and you got to go with the flow, So anyhow.
Something to think about.
Yeah. One more question. Do you agree that if Fox News really became less Trump news, other than the Fox poll, Trump would finally lose his 40% base?
Oh, he might well. Fox News is fundamental to his campaign. Fox News is fundamental to many other campaigns ever since its origins. We've never again, in the 19th century, all newspapers were committed to a given party, one way or the other. In the 1920s, the New York Times and several other newspapers said they were going to change things. The public was too educated for that. The public wanted to hear both sides of things, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the goal, at least. Keeping objectivity is hard and so forth, but that was the goal. When Fox News appeared, they proved, and so did conservative radio, talk radio hosts, proved that at least in terms of conservative values, et cetera, that this method worked well, and it does, and it helps organize the party and helps provide leadership for the party, even and support for the party. So Fox News is very much connected to Trump, and Trump is very much connected to Fox News. Yes.
We also have a comment here that people would love to hear you talk about the election in the fall.
Okay, we'll see about that. Yes. Okay. Good idea. All right. Thank you.